With the London Naval Treaty cutting off loopholes and reducing fleet sizes, the Imperial Japanese Navy decided that the only way to get an advantage which they believed they needed in a potential war with the US Navy was to build a series of disguised ships, vessels which appeared to be one thing, relatively unoffensive, but could then be rapidly turned into far more effective warships at short notice. One of the ideas that they came up with in the early 1930s was for a seagoing mini-sub carrier. The idea being to take a dozen short-range submarines with high underwater speed out to sea with the fleet. Once a fleet battle was about to commence, these ships would rush ahead of the fleet, deploy the submarines, and the submarines would then launch a swarm attack on the enemy battle line at the very last minute. The problem was that this kind of ship would need to be quite fast to keep up with the fleet, and this, combined with its purpose as a submarine carrier, would mean at the very least it would use up tonnage in the treaty-limited categories, or might even possibly be not allowed. And so it was decided to officially build a pair of ships as seaplane carriers, with minimal armament and a speed of less than 20 knots. They would not be therefore classified as warships in the treaty's categories, and so they could act as a definite surprise reserve. The fundamental principles of both seaplane and submarine carriers worked relatively well enough for the purposes of the disguise, as both needed a large hangar space, a lift and crane setup to bring large heavy objects up out of this hangar onto the deck, and guide rails to position them for launch, plus of course a large amount of additional fuel tanks. Apart from the ship's top speed, the differences would be in the details, particularly the rather large hatch that was needed to get the submarines in and out. But the requirements didn't stop there, as the Japanese Navy also called for the ships to be able to, if desired, be adapted to the role of either a fast fleet tanker, a semi-carrier with a flight deck aft for recovery of damaged and lost aircraft in a fleet action, or a full light fleet carrier, fast enough to keep up with the other big fleet carriers. The light carrier role, like the submarine carrier role, therefore required a much higher top speed, and all roles needed a lot of fuel storage in one respect or another. And so the design evolved with some rather unusual features. For propulsion, 2 shafts were provided. Each was to be linked to a diesel engine for cruising, but as it turned out, each diesel engine was capable of only 6,400 brake horsepower, which was a little short of the power output originally envisaged for them, and so an additional pair of small 3,000 shaft horsepower cruising turbines were fitted. This combined power plant would allow the ships to cruise for very long distances at up to 16 knots. To reach 30 knots, the turbine sets from the recent Hatsuhara-class destroyers were also included as a separate power plant. The official plans showed that each of these turbine sets had just a single boiler room, and it was claimed that this would allow the ships to proceed at just 20 knots when needed, a 4-knot advantage over the 16-knot very efficient diesel drives. In fact, what was labelled as yet another set of fuel tank rooms nearby were actually a second set of boiler rooms, which would then allow the turbines to push the ships through the water at between 29 and 30 knots. At first, the plan was to just install the first set of boilers and install the second set later on, but during construction they decided to discreetly include the second set of boilers anyway and then just not use them or tell anyone about them until they were needed. As a way of concealing the submarine-sized lift and hatch, as well as to provide support for heavy-duty cranes and to test out the flight deck concept, 4 massive pillars were installed aft, with a platform built between them, which initially covered the hatch from easy observation, sold to the rest of the world as a rather extensive way of weatherproofing the hangar against rain while the hatch was open, and also providing a platform which allowed for somewhere for the anti-aircraft guns and searchlights to go that wouldn't interfere with seaplane operations. The original plans called for a total of 24 seaplanes to be carried, but the final arrangements left the ships only capable of carrying 20, as additional fuel storage and other things below deck reduced the hangar capacity. In the event of using them to transport the attack submarines, a dozen aircraft would be retained on the upper deck to ensure that the disguise of seaplane carrier was maintained until the very last moment. As launched, armament was limited to a pair of twin 5-inch gun mounts forward and a dozen 25mm anti-aircraft guns on the platform, with 2 ships built, Chitose and Chiyoda. Although they were laid down almost 2 years apart in late 1934 and 1936 respectively, they would both commission in the latter part of 1938. Initially seeing service in the Sino-Japanese War 1930s edition, their fates then diverged somewhat. Chitose was used extensively to support the construction of a number of seaplane and flying boat bases prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, while Chiyoda was taken in hand to have her hangar converted more fully to the intended original mini-sub carrier role, which limited her air group. Both ships were present during the Battle of Midway, with Chiyoda supposed to deploy her mini-subs to a nearby atoll, which was planned would be used as a submarine and flying boat base, while Chitose was to provide recon and basic fighter support to the invasion forces themselves. The loss of the Kido Butai, however, scuppered these plans, and both ships then spent a couple of months supporting the building of more seaplane bases before being assigned to the Guadalcanal campaign. Chiyoda spent most of this at truck, occasionally delivering mini-subs to various Japanese bases, while Chitose provided recon and anti-recon support to Imperial Japanese Navy forces in a number of engagements, something she'd also done before Midway, before being pressed into service as a fast transport as the Japanese sought increasingly desperate measures to try and keep hold of Guadalcanal and keep their troops there supplied. At the start of 1943, with still further attrition to the Japanese carrier forces, both ships were recalled for conversion into 30-plane light carriers. Although this was supposed to be done quickly, for various reasons it ended up taking essentially all of 1943. They eventually emerged at the start of 1944, with the small platform having been extended to a full-length flight deck, a extensive upper hangar as most of the superstructure and the forward armament had been removed, with the existing hangar in the hull having been converted into a secondary hangar, and the bridge significantly cut down and moved further forward, which meant the new upper hangar wasn't entirely full length. But although being light carriers, by 1944 they were promoted to frontline carrier units. Their first major action was the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where most of their air groups were wiped out and Chiyoda got hit by a bomb. After repairs, both were then assigned to the Northern Force Decoy Group for the Battle of Leyte Gulf. With minimal aircraft available, both ships would then be sunk in the US Navy's counterattack. Chitose took 3 hits on one side and sank within about an hour, while Chiyoda took 4 hits, but with them being more widely spaced, she simply settled a bit, although she was crippled. Unable to be towed despite their best efforts, the remaining Japanese ships had to abandon her, and she was eventually discovered by 4 US cruisers, which finished her off with gunfire.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.